The Brass Spur Saloon stood like a crooked tooth in Tombstone's dusty smile. Men with hard eyes and harder lives drifted through its swinging doors, seeking liquid courage or fleeting fortune. Arizona Territory, 1,883. And the West was still deciding what kind of place it aimed to be. Silas McGraw entered with the quiet of a man who'd learned that noise draws bullets. His boots wore the tale of long miles, cracked leather speaking of 3 summers without rain. His eyes, blue as distant mountains but just as weathered, scanned the room with the practiced caution of a man who'd once scouted for the Union. The high-stakes table drew him like thirst to water. 5 men hunched over cards, but only one mattered. Jed Colton, whose silver-handled revolvers caught lamplight like snake eyes. His fingers, unnaturally clean for frontier country, stacked coins with the precision of a banker, though banking wasn't his trade. Not the legal kind, leastways. McGraw, Jed acknowledged without looking up. Thought drought might have finally buried you. Takes more than dry skies to kill a stubborn man. Silas pulled out a chair, the scrape against floorboards drawing glances. I've seen desperate men before. Watched them in war camps, gambling away blankets in winter. But the look in McGraw's eyes that night carried something worse than desperation. It carried surrender. Behind Jed stood a girl, thin as autumn grass. Couldn't be more than 14, with bruises yellowing along her jawline. Her eyes, hollow as abandoned mine shafts, fixed on nothing. A child who'd seen too much of the world's true face. Last hand before I head east, Jed announced, shuffling cards with flourish. Unless someone wants to make things interesting. The silence stretched until Jed nodded toward the girl. Maycotton, collateral for a debt she couldn't honor. Turns out boarding house orphans make poor business partners, he laughed, but no one joined him. Put her in the pot, Jed said, eyes boring into Silas. One hand, you win, she's yours, legal papers and all. The saloon quieted like a church on Monday. Men who'd seen every manner of frontier depravity shifted uncomfortably. Wagering cattle, land, even gold teeth wasn't uncommon. But a child? Silas's calloused hand hovered over his cards. The girl's eyes lifted then, meeting his across tobacco smoke and moral decay. Something stirred in that empty gaze, not hope, but recognition. One wounded creature seeing another. Deal, Silas said. Time was, Broken Lantern Ranch had been something to behold. 3 years back, before drought cracked the earth and turned creek beds to dust trails. Before fever swept through his herd, taking all but 30 head of longhorn. Now the ranch was like its namesake, a broken thing still trying to cast light. Jed and Silas had history deeper than a well in springtime. 4 years earlier, they'd bloodied each other over water rights to Cottonwood Creek. Silas carried a jagged scar across his collarbone. Jed carried grudges that festered like untreated wounds. As for the girl, May had been working Jed's books since he acquired her from a failed boarding house in Tucson. Smart enough to balance ledgers, unfortunate enough to know which numbers didn't add up. In Jed's world, knowledge without loyalty was a death sentence, with delayed execution. The final card slid across green felt. Silas revealed his hand straight flush. Jed's smile faltered as he showed his full house. Well now, Jed whispered, seems fortune favors fools. His hand shot out, grabbing May's thin wrist with white-knuckled fury. The girl didn't flinch, having learned that resistance only fed men's anger. Silas stood, placing himself between them. Papers first, he said quietly. She's mine now, fair and square. Something flashed in May's eyes, then not gratitude but calculation. Silas recognized it from watching Union prisoners plotting escapes, weighing risk against intolerable certainty. Outside, night wind carried dust devils down Tombstone's main street. Silas shrugged off his canvas duster, placing it around May's shoulders without touching her. The space between them spoke of respect rarely granted to children, especially girls with nowhere to belong. Can you ride? He asked. Yes? Her first word, spoken without emotion. The miles stretched before them, moonlight painting the trail silver. Broken Lantern lay half a day's ride northward, a place of hard work and harder memories. "He'll come for me," May said suddenly. "Not for me, for what I know." Her fingers touched a hidden pocket in her boot, the gesture unconscious but revealing. Silas noticed her hands, then not a child's soft palms, but fingers calloused from pen and paper, marked by ink stains and purpose. "Whatever you know, it's yours to tell, or keep." May studied his profile against the rising moon. "You're not like the others," she said finally. "You don't want something from me." The shadow of Broken Lantern appeared on the horizon as dawn crept across eastern mountains, a weathered homestead with sagging barn and scattered cattle. Silas felt the girl tense behind him. "Your wife won't want a stray bringing trouble," May whispered. Silas's grip tightened imperceptibly on the reins. The hard truth of those words settled between them, heavy as storm clouds promising rain that never falls. Broken Lantern Ranch greeted them like a tired old dog still standing but worn by years and weather. The homestead squatted low against prairie winds, 3 rooms of rough-hewn timber with a stone hearth that had seen better days. Windows patched with oilcloth fluttered like nervous breaths when the wind picked up. Furniture inside bore the marks of hard use and harder times, a table smoothed by countless meals, chairs mended with rawhide strips, a rocking chair that creaked tales of long nights. Eleanor McGraw stood framed in the doorway as they approached, her shadow stretching toward them like hope across the yard. "I seen that look before on women's faces when menfolk return from long absence, first joy, then something else entirely when they spy unexpected company. Silas?" Her voice carried across the yard, hope draining from it faster than water through desert sand when her eyes landed on May. Confusion bloomed, then hurt, as Silas dismounted and led the girl forward. "Eleanor, this is May Cotton. She needed somewhere safe." The explanation hung between them, insufficient as a single raindrop in drought. May stood apart, pressed against the porch post like a cornered coyote. She refused the offered chair, the cup of thin stew, the concerned glances, everything that might suggest she needed something she couldn't provide herself. Eleanor studied the girl, lips pressed tight as a winter purse. "You will sleep in the back room," she finally announced, voice neither warm nor cold. "Work starts at dawn." That night, lying on a straw-tick mattress thinner than truth, May listened to the whispered argument through walls no thicker than paper. Eleanor's voice broke over words like lost babies and strange children, while Silas rumbled assurances too low to catch. Neither knowing their every word fell on ears that had learned survival meant hearing what folks thought went unheard. Morning broke harsh across the prairie. May found Silas already working the corral, shoulders bent under more than just the physical load. Without looking up, he handed her a worn leather satchel that had seen years of use. "Tools," he said simply. Inside lay a knife with bone handle rubbed smooth, leather gloves patched at the fingertips, length of sturdy twine. Not gifts, equipment. May took to ranch work like she'd been born to it. Small hands hauled water from the well until blisters formed, then broke, then calloused. She fed the meager herd of cattle, whose ribs showed through their hides like sad memories. Fence posts that had surrendered to gravity found themselves upright again under her determined efforts. From first light until stars pierced the darkening sky, she worked without complaint or pause. Eleanor watched from windows at first, suspicion in her gaze. 3 days passed before she approached May directly, holding mending needles and thread like peace offerings. "Your dress is coming apart at the seams," she said, not unkindly. "Learn this." 5 nights later, May returned to her room to find a small wooden box beside her bedroll. Inside lay dried apple slices, their sweetness preserved through winter stores, not charity recognition of work done well. When Eleanor discovered May couldn't read, no comment passed her lips. But the next evening, a slate and chalk appeared beside the girl's plate. Quiet lessons began in the glow of lamplight, Eleanor's finger tracing letters, while May's quick mind absorbed them faster than spring ground drinks rain. 2 weeks into her stay, May remained behind when Silas rode to town for supplies. The question had built inside her like pressure before storm, finally breaking free when Eleanor was elbow-deep in bread dough. "Why didn't you send me away?" May asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Most women would." Eleanor's hands stilled, flour dusting her forearms like early snow. "3 babies," she said after a long moment. Never drew breath. Her voice cracked on the final word. "Maybe God has strange ways of answering prayers." The confession hung between them, fragile as spider silk. "I had a mother once," May offered, the words feeling strange on her tongue after years unused. "She sang while working. Then fever took her, left me to streets where Jed found me." Eleanor nodded, understanding passing between them without need for more. "Come here," she said, gesturing to the dough. "Bread won't wait on sad memories." Side by side they worked, hands kneading in rhythm that spoke more than words could carry. The silence between them changed from wary to companionable, like winter thawing to spring. Later that week, Eleanor found a small wooden bird perched beside her mending basket. Carved with unexpected skill, its wings seemed poised for flight despite being bound to wood. She touched it gently, understanding the gift's meaning without words passing between them. Night still found May listening to the house settling around her, wondering if this shelter was as temporary as all others before. The ledger hidden in her boot grew heavier with each passing day, laden with secrets that could destroy Jed Colton or bring his vengeance down upon this place where something like peace had begun to take root. "I've spent years guarding every secret, every emotion, treating kindness as bait for a trap. But here, with these broken people in this broken place, something inside me wants to believe in second chances. Can I trust that what they offer comes without hidden price? The ledger in my boot grows heavier each day. It could destroy Jed Colton or bring his vengeance down on this ranch. If I show them what I know, will they use me just like he did, or will they become the family I've forgotten how to hope for?" The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge when Silas found them hoofprints circling the property like a noose. Not the casual wandering of lost travelers, nor the straight purpose of honest visitors. These tracks spoke of watching, waiting, measuring. "Been there since before dawn," Silas muttered, crouching to press his fingers against the indentations. 3 riders, maybe 4. One horse favoring its left foreleg. May stood behind him, arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill, eyes fixed on the circular trail that marked their vulnerability. "He's found us," she whispered, her voice thin as winter wind. The past week had brought whispers following Silas through town like stray dogs. Folks who'd traded fare with him for years now turned their eyes away, conversations dying when he approached the general store counter. "Heard you stole property from Jed Colton," Simmons had finally said, not meeting Silas's gaze as he weighed coffee beans. "Girl, weren't it? Got adoption papers for that child?" "I watched men lie with straight faces during the war, claiming they'd never raided civilian homesteads when their saddlebags still carried stolen silver." The way Silas's jaw tightened told me this was worse than mere gossip. It was the first volley in a battle coming straight for his door. Sheriff Adams arrived 3 days later, dust coating his dark beard, eyes hidden beneath his hat brim. His casual dismount and lazy survey of the property fooled neither Silas nor May, who watched from the kitchen window, fingers white around a wooden spoon. "Fine day," Adams remarked, declining coffee as he leaned against the porch post. "Just making rounds. Heard you had some trouble." "No trouble here," Silas answered, hand resting near his belt where a knife waited. "Funny thing," Adams continued, as if Silas hadn't spoken. "Jed Colton's been asking after some property gone missing. Valuable property, way he tells it." The sheriff's eyes lingered too long on windows and doors, measuring distances, noting the Winchester propped beside the doorframe. "You let me know if any strangers come through," he said finally, times being what they are. That night, May began sleeping with a kitchen knife beneath her pillow, waking at every creak of the settling house. Dark circles formed beneath her eyes, vigilance stealing rest she couldn't afford to lose. Frontier seasons show no mercy for human troubles. An unexpected late frost killed the newly planted crops, leaving the ranch more vulnerable as winter approached without sufficient stores. Fields that should have been greening lay brown and brittle under the morning sun, promises withered before fulfillment. Eleanor took to her bed with fever 3 days after the sheriff's visit, her slight frame burning beneath quilts, while Silas divided himself between tending his wife and salvaging what cattle remained. May stepped into household management without being asked, her small hands moving with surprising competence between cooking pot and ledger book. When Silas rode to neighboring ranches seeking to purchase supplies, doors closed before conversations began. Some feared Jed's retribution for helping the McGraws. Others simply believed rumors about the criminal girl they'd taken in. Henderson said they had nothing to spare, Silas reported, exhaustion etching lines deeper around his eyes. Pritchard's claimed their extra seed was promised elsewhere. 20 years neighboring, and suddenly, no one's got a pound of flour to trade. During night watches, May took to studying the ranch ledgers by candlelight, her fingers tracing columns of numbers with growing concern. The debts ran deeper than Silas had admitted. Bankruptcy loomed within months, even without Jed's shadow darkening their door. The only moment of grace came during Eleanor's slow recovery. May sat beside her bed, dampening her forehead with cool cloths, when something stirred in her memory. "Rest your weary soul, my child," May recited softly, "for dawn brings light anew. The darkest night still yields to day, as sorrows yield to you." Eleanor's eyes opened, fever bright but focused. A smile, genuine for the first time, crossed her pale features as she reached weakly to touch May's hand. "You have her voice in you still," she whispered. "Your mother's." That night, as moonlight spilled across the kitchen table, May made her decision. From her boot, she withdrew a small leather-bound ledger, its edges worn smooth from constant proximity to her skin. "This is why he'll never stop hunting me," she said, placing it before Silas. "I kept the real books while he showed banks and partners fakes. I know who he owns across 3 territories." Silas turned pages filled with precise handwriting, names, dates, bribes paid to judges and marshals. Sheriff Adams appeared repeatedly, payments noted beside cases dismissed. "What you're holding would hang men from San Francisco to Santa Fe," May said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Silas studied the pages before looking up, resolve hardening his features. "Then we don't run. We use what you know not for revenge, but for protection." Old Hank Watson arrived the following afternoon, ostensibly delivering horseshoes. The former Pinkerton agent's weathered face betrayed nothing as he examined the property with experienced eyes. "Jed's hired 3 men specifically to find the girl," he murmured, hammering with deliberate strokes. "Two-Finger Jackson among them. Means he's spending serious money." Hank recognized the ledger's significance instantly. "Girls holding dynamite. Question is where to set the fuse that won't blow us all to kingdom come." Before leaving, he placed a loaded Winchester rifle against the wall. "Eleanor, you still shoot as straight as you did in 2075? Might need to remember how." That evening, May and Silas planned carefully over maps spread across the kitchen table, marking locations of allies, routes to federal marshals beyond Jed's influence. As night fell across the valley, Silas noticed at first the lantern in the barn, unlit when they'd entered the house, now glowed faintly in the darkness. A signal no one in the family had lit. Morning came whisper-soft to Broken Lantern Ranch, the kind of quiet that puts your hackles up if you've lived long enough on this frontier. Stars still hung in the western sky as Silas positioned the last of his defenders, 3 neighboring ranchers and their oldest boys behind the stone well housing. Men who owed him favors from winters past when his cattle fed their families, now repaying that debt with loaded rifles and solemn nods. "Silas," called Hank Watson, in a voice weathered by tobacco and years riding for the Pinkertons, "your southern approach is mighty exposed. 1 man ain't enough." Silas squinted toward the cottonwoods that lined the creek bed. "Put the Tolliver boy there with Jackson. He's young but steady. Inside the barn, Eleanor filled canteens and distributed ammunition pouches, her illness forgotten in the measured efficiency of her movements. The fever that had kept her bedridden just days before seemed burned away by necessity. I've seen that transformation before, in war camps where dying men stood shoulder to shoulder against advancing rebels. Their sickness temporarily surrendered to more pressing survival. "I'm taking the hayloft," May announced, appearing at Eleanor's side with the Winchester Hank had provided. The girl's hands, small but steady on the polished wood, betrayed no tremor. "That position's exposed," Silas objected, entering with a box of shotgun shells. "I can see every approach from there," May countered, her voice level as creek water. "And I know how to shoot." Jed made sure of that. Eleanor and Silas exchanged glances, a married couple's silent conversation. "First sign of trouble, you get down," Eleanor finally said, handing May extra shells. As false dawn painted the eastern horizon with watercolor promises, Silas entrusted a sealed copy of the ledger to Thomas Blackfeather, a Pawnee tracker who'd guided him during the war. "North route," Silas instructed, passing over the oilskin-wrapped package. "Federal Marshal in Fort Smith will know what to do with this." Thomas nodded once, disappeared into the shadows like a man who understood that words were luxuries in times like these. The clock in the kitchen ticked past 4. Birds should have been stirring, but even they seemed to hold their breath. That's when it came, not with gunfire as expected, but with a whispering arc through darkness. The bottle, flame licking at its rag-stuffed neck, sailed through the kitchen window. Glass shattered, fire bloomed against the floor like some hellish desert flower. "Send out the girl and her book, McGraw." Jed's voice floated from darkness beyond the yard, followed by scattered laughter. "I'll let your wife keep breathing." Eleanor smothered the flames with a quilt, her movements practiced from years battling prairie blazes that threatened their land. The first shot came from above, from the hayloft. May's rifle cracked with surprising authority, and a shadow by the corral crumpled with a strangled cry. The girl had been more than just a bookkeeper, it seemed. Hell itself broke loose then. Bullets tore through weathered wood and remaining glass. Eleanor steadied herself at the kitchen window, the family shotgun braced against her shoulder like an old friend. Silas fired methodically from the front porch until a bullet caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him against the doorframe. Blood darkened his shirt as he gritted his teeth, returned fire. "I've spent my life being owned, traded, wagered, but today I'm fighting for something that matters, for people who see me as more than property. If I die here, I'll die free, and that's worth every bullet I have left." Just as ammunition ran thin as hope in drought season, hoofbeats thundered from the east. Hank Watson led 5 riders charging hard across the open ground, their approach catching Jed's men in unexpected crossfire. The neighbors Silas had positioned emerged from hiding places, their coordinated volleys forcing attackers toward the creek, where more defenders waited. May scrambled down from the hayloft, dragging Silas behind the stone water trough. She tore strips from her dress for bandages, small hands working with determination while Eleanor provided covering fire from the doorway. When Sheriff Adams finally arrived, the sun had crested the horizon. Most of Jed's men lay captured or had fled into the hills. The lawman's late appearance spoke volumes about allegiances that money had purchased. "Seems I missed the excitement," he drawled, surveying the smoke-filled yard with careful disinterest. Through the clearing gunsmoke, they watched Jed Colton himself gallop eastward, a diminishing figure against the rising Sunday. "This ain't over," his voice carried back. "I got marshals and judges from here to Kansas who'll finish what we started." One of the captured men, nursing a bullet-shattered knee, laughed bitterly. "Colton's got copies of labor contracts," says the girl's indentured propper. "Got territorial law on his side, whatever else you might claim." Silas, pale as December frost from blood loss, locked eyes with May across the yard strewn with brass casings that caught the morning light like scattered gold. "This won't end until he does," Silas said quietly, "or until he believes you're no longer worth chasing." The territorial judge's buckboard creaked up the path to Broken Lantern 3 days after the raid, dust trailing behind like hesitant shadows. Judge Carlton weren't a man who traveled light. His reputation for incorruptibility weighed heavier than the law books stacked beside him. May watched from the porch steps, fingers worrying the edge of her borrowed apron. Behind her, Silas sat propped against pillows Eleanor had dragged from their bed, his shoulder bound tight with linen that needed changing more often than they let on. Old Hank Watson dismounted first, helping the silver-haired judge down with the careful respect frontier folk reserved for men whose word could hang you or set you free. In Hank's weathered saddlebags rested letters I'd seen him reading by lamplight, correspondence from Pinkerton men who'd been tracking Jed Colton's dealings across 3 territories. "Judge," Silas acknowledged, attempting to stand before Eleanor's firm hand on his good shoulder, kept him seated. "McGraw." The judge removed his hat, revealing a sunburned scalp beneath thinning hair. "Heard you had yourself a disagreement with half the territory's troublemakers." Hank spread the letters across the rough-hewn table. "These men don't write without cause, Judge. Agency's been building a case against Colton for years. Girl's ledger matches their findings name for name, date for date." Judge Carlton's eyes found May, measuring her like a man accustomed to weighing truth against lies. "You prepared to testify to what's written in that book, child?" May stepped forward, her voice steadier than her knees. "Every page, sir. February 12th, Colton paid Sheriff Adams $50 to overlook cattle rustling. March 4th, Judge Peterson received $300 to dismiss charges against the Durbin brothers. April." The judge raised his hand. "You've a memory for numbers." "And faces," May added. "I can identify 15 men who delivered payments, collected debts, or threatened those who wouldn't pay." Eleanor appeared in the doorway then, clutching papers yellowed with age and waiting. She glanced at Silas, who nodded once. "We've adoption papers here," Eleanor said, "drawn up years back when we hoped for a child." Her voice caught like cloth on a nail. "Never had cause to use them, until now." Sheriff Adams arrived as the judge was reviewing the documents, his deputy trailing behind with nervous eyes. The sheriff's hand hovered near his pistol until he noticed Judge Carlton's presence. "This is territorial business, Adams," the judge said without looking up. "Your involvement isn't required. Any disturbance in my jurisdiction is suspended," Carlton interrupted, finally raising his eyes, "along with your authority pending investigation into certain financial arrangements detailed in this ledger." The air stilled like the moment before lightning strikes. Adams' face darkened as understanding dawned. "That's so," he managed through clenched teeth. "It is." The judge dipped his pen in ink, signature flowing across the adoption papers. "Congratulations, Miss May McGraw. You're now under the protection of both family and territorial law." May's fingers trembled as she took the pen, signing her new name with careful strokes. The wet ink glistened in the afternoon light, more binding than blood, more powerful than fear. Word traveled faster than horses in the territory. By sunset, 3 neighboring ranchers arrived with supplies and news. Men who'd stood with the McGraws during the raid were now refusing Jed's demands for grazing fees on contested land. Storekeeper Wilson had torn up Jed's protection agreement. The blacksmith had turned away Jed's men when they brought horses for shoeing. The girl with the ledger had become something more than a witness. She'd become a symbol. When darkness fell and Judge Carlton retired to the room they'd prepared, Silas beckoned May to his side. "I'm riding to Tombstone tomorrow," he whispered. "Your shoulder," she started. "Won't kill me." His eyes held hers. "This needs ending." "He won't stop," May warned. "Men like him don't know how." "Then we'll teach him." The Brass Spur saloon stood empty save for Jed Colton and ghosts of his former influence. Whiskey bottle before him, silver-handled revolvers still gleaming despite the tarnish spreading through his empire. Silas entered just as he had months before, but this time his steps carried purpose, not desperation. The ledger rested inside his coat, heavy as a promise. "McGraw." Jed didn't look up. Thought you'd be dead by now." "Disappointment's part of living," Silas answered, sliding the ledger onto the table between them. Jed's eyes narrowed. "What's this supposed to be?" "Terms." Silas kept his voice level. "You walk away. You forget her. You tell your men she's dead and buried." Laughter bubbled from Jed's throat, ugly as an open grave. "And I let you live because?" "Because I didn't make copies," Silas lied, knowing duplicates rested with 3 different judges. "I trusted you to be just scared enough not to test me." Jed's fingers traced the leather cover, his creation, now his destruction. Time stretched between them, measured in heartbeats and calculation. Finally, a nod, not surrender but assessment, weighing survival against revenge. 4 days after Silas returned to Broken Lantern, May spotted it first smoke rising beyond the eastern ridge, where the Wilsons and Burkes had small holdings. Families who'd stood with rifles alongside the McGraws during the raid. She stood on the porch, watching distant flames climb toward cloudless sky. Her fingers traced the McGraw name on her adoption papers, the ink no longer wet, but the promise still fresh. "He's not leaving," she said as Silas joined her, rifle in hand. "He's just changing targets. I've seen enough frontier battles to know when one ends and another begins." The McGraws had won their family that day, but the war for what they'd built was just kindling. The year 1887 came to Broken Lantern Ranch on winds gentler than those that had swept through 4 years prior. What once stood as 3 weathered rooms now sprawled across the hillside like a small town unto itself. 9 children called it home, orphans, runaways and castaways from frontier towns, where childhood meant little more than small hands for labor. May McGraw, no longer the hollow-eyed waif from the brass spur, rode tall in the saddle alongside Silas, her keen mind for figures having transformed drought-plagued pastures into fields that yielded enough to feed their growing family. At 18, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had faced down the worst of humanity and found herself unbroken. "Riders coming," she called one spring morning, shading eyes against the sunrise. Her hand no longer reached instinctively for a weapon, a habit that had taken 2 years to break. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, wiping flour from capable hands. The schoolroom behind her stood empty for the morning, slate boards still bearing yesterday's arithmetic. "Sheriff's with them," Silas noted, lowering his axe. "And that's Judge Whitaker's buggy." News traveled slow as molasses in January across the territory, but word eventually reached them by telegraph. Jed Colton had died in Tucson prison. Not by violence or hanging as many expected, but consumption that withered his immaculate hands and silenced his silver tongue. His empire of bribes and threats collapsed like a house built on sand. Investigations sparked by a single leather-bound ledger kept by a girl he'd considered property. Sheriff Holloway, who'd replaced the disgraced Adams, dismounted with a respectful nod. "Miss McGraw," he said, tipping his hat to May. No longer the suspicious stray, but the woman whose testimony had cleaned corruption from 3 counties. "Official business," Judge Whitaker announced, producing documents that caught sunlight. "Territory's recognized Broken Lantern as a licensed home for orphaned children. Comes with modest stipend each month." That evening, with official papers signed and visitors departed, May climbed to the barn loft, where she'd kept watch during the raid years before. From a wooden box wrapped in oilcloth, she withdrew pieces of metal and glass she'd gathered over years, fragments of the original lantern that had given the ranch its name. "Been working on this since winter," she told Silas when he found her bent over her workbench. "Figured it was time." 3 days later, they gathered all 13 of them beside the main gate. The lantern, repaired with patient hands and clever soldering, hung from a freshly carved post. May's fingers trembled slightly as she struck the match. "Ranch got its name from this very light," Silas explained to the children who'd never heard the tale. "Brought me through a blizzard back in 2068, though it was cracked clean through. Kept it as reminder ever since." The flame caught, sending warm light spilling across weathered faces. "A broken light doesn't mean darkness forever," Silas continued, his voice carrying the weight of years. Sometimes it means finding new ways to shine. Later that spring, as evening painted the hills gold, May stood watching a wagon approach. 3 small figures huddled in back, a boy clutching moldy bread against his chest, a girl with burn marks tracking up thin arms, and a third child so small May couldn't tell if it was boy or girl. She recognized the wariness in their posture, the calculation of escape routes. The distrust of kindness that experience had taught them was merely bait for a crueler trap. When the wagon stopped, May knelt before them, seeing her younger self reflected in their eyes. "You're safe," she said simply. "You work. You learn. You stay, if you want." Behind her, the ranch glowed warm against gathering darkness. The repaired lantern cast its steady beam across the yard, where children's laughter had replaced years of silence, a beacon for those still lost on frontier's edge, seeking home.